Bom dia a todos, bom dia a todas. Eu peço agora que se coloque a tela com as logomarcas das empresas que patrocinam a programação anual de seminários da Fundação. E gostaria de agradecer a todas e a cada uma delas. So now, let's start. Anne, I will introduce you briefly and then Simon, but I would do something that I normally don't, which is I've written something that I would like to read. It's a way to explain why we have invited you, right? Because people have received the invitation with your impressive resume, right? So I think it's useless to repeat the information that is already in the resume, right? You are an accomplished journalist, an accomplished historian, have written remarkable books about the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, the Sovietization of the Eastern Europe. I have one of your books here, The Gulag, A Story. You got the Pulitzer Prize for that. I have a dedication of your own, and I'm very proud of that. And so you have a strong economic background. You are one of the leading public intellectuals in the global scene. I think it's no exaggeration in saying that. But having said that, and before introducing Simon, who hardly needs any introduction, everybody knows Simon here in Brazil. Let me read a couple of paragraphs that I have written, if you allow me a few minutes. Anne is a voice to be heard attentively, not only because she is an accomplished journalist with a strong academic background, not only because she's the author of remarkable books about a history of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and the horrors of totalitarianism, but also because she's been playing a leading role as a public intellectual in the analysis of and the fight against the emergence of far-right movements, parties, and governments in the US and Europe, the United Kingdom included, and sheds light on the critical role played by part of the cultural, economic, and political elite in this process. She holds them accountable for their complicity, the betrayal of true liberal values, and knows the story from within. Some of its main actors were her friends or colleagues back in the 90s in the conservative circles of intellectuals, journalists, policymakers, and politicians in Europe and the US. Her most recent book, The Twilight of Democracy, shows how and tell why some of them fell for the seductive lure of authoritarianism, to quote the subtitle of her book. There are lessons to be learned from the story told by Anne, and I'm afraid they're applicable not only to the US and Europe, but also to other places of the Western world. Thank you for your patience, Anne and Simon, for hearing this, because this is, I think, explain why we were eager to invite you to speak to a Brazilian audience. The rules of the game, the rules of engagement here, right? I will ask an opening question for Anne, and then we'll expand the conversation with the contribution of Simon. Everybody knows Simon. Simon is one of the most accomplished Brazilian social scientists and a long-time friend of the Cardoso Foundation. And so it's a pleasure to have you here with us today for this conversation, Simon. Let me start, Anne, by asking you about the future of Trumpism in the US, or in other words, the fight for the battle of the GOP. Is the GOP a lost case, or it can be the grand old party can be recovered for the sake of democracy in the US and the world?
It's really a delight to be here with you virtually or spiritually or however I am with you. I'm sorry that I'm not in Brazil. And it's lovely to see you and Simon again. I really appreciate the invitation very much. I think the important thing to understand about the Republican Party, which is still one of our two main parties. It's a It still enjoys the support of just about half the population in the United States and the majority in many states, is that a part of the party, has become, is increasingly captured by an anti-democratic ideology. Think about what you saw on January 6th, what we all saw on January 6th, when a group of violent demonstrators broke into the Capitol building and tried to interrupt what was going on in Congress. This was not a Republicans attacking Democrats. This didn't represent polarization. This wasn't a civil war and there weren't two sides fighting each other. This was a part of the Republican Party which is now against the system itself. In other words, they weren't attacking Democrats, they were attacking the whole institution. They were attacking Congress, the Capitol being the symbol of Congress, and they were trying to stop Congress from carrying out a constitutional function, which was the recognition of the presidential election. So that was what was happening that day. They were, Mike Pence was presiding over the Congress. Its job was to recognize the votes of our electoral college and to declare that Joe Biden would become president on January the 20th. And the group at the Capitol wanted to prevent that process. And that's openly what they were saying they wanted to do. And that's what Trump told them he wanted them to do. And I don't know that all of them went there with the idea of violence in their heads, although some did. There were people talking about hanging Mike Pence, the vice president. There were people who, once they entered the Capitol, started looking for Nancy Pelosi, who's the Speaker of the House of Representatives, and for others who they were looking to possibly murder, possibly kidnap. We don't know. They fortunately didn't find anybody because the guards in the building got people out of the chambers and out of the building very quickly once they understood what had happened. But the point is they were seeking to disrupt the process of democracy. If this group were limited just to those people, the whatever 3,000 or 4,000 people who were there on the Mall in Washington D.C. on the 6th, they might not be a big political problem. I mean, all countries have little insurgencies or groups of extremists, and that's not doesn't necessarily have to be a threat to democracy. The difficulty with this group is that it enjoys actually very large support in the country. In a poll done a few days after the Capitol riots, 21% of Americans, not just 21% of the Republican Party, said that they supported the rioters at the Capitol. So maybe that number is exaggerated, maybe it's gone down, maybe it will go down as people begin to understand more about what happened that day. It was all very unclear in the first few days. Maybe that represents a lot of people who don't pay much attention to the news, and if they thought about it, maybe might not be supportive. But say it's half that. Say it's 10% of Americans. That's a very serious number of people. That's 10% of the country who don't accept the rules of democracy, who don't believe in our electoral system, who don't trust even the Republican electoral officials, state officials in places like Georgia or Arizona, who recognize the vote. So this is now a group which is against, I say it's against the mainstream of the Republican Party, but it's against the elected, but I mean more than that. They're against the elected officials of the Republican Party, and they don't believe in the electoral system even that chose them. So they are now opposed to the political system as it exists now. And this is a different kind of challenge from the normal ideological splits. I mean, our political parties, because we have a two-party system, have always been huge coalitions, in fact. They call them umbrella parties. The Republican Party has always had liberal, kind of economic liberals. It's always had traditional Christians. It's always had kind of establishment people, so-called country club Republicans who just like the status quo. They've always represented different kinds of conservatism. And by the same token, the Democratic Party has also always been a big tent that represented a wide range of political views from from pretty far left actually to really very centrist. But this is a new kind of faction. So the faction that now exists inside the Republican Party cannot be characterized as ideologically left or right. It's anti-systemic. It opposes the system. And that's a different kind of challenge for the party because a large number of Republican voters now belong to that faction. And they are, because of the way our voting system works, they are particularly influential in some constituencies and some states. So there will be now members of Congress, most of whose constituents will now represent that anti-systemic view. And you can already hear them in Congress. It's not the majority, but there is a strong minority of Republican members of Congress who represent anti-systemic constituencies and who are starting to sound more and more radical. And so the problem for the Republican Party is, how are they going to deal with that? What are they going to do with those people? Will those people eventually take over the party? Will the party kick them out? Will the mainstream Republicans, by which I mean very conservative people, I don't mean mainstream centrist, I mean mainstream right-wing, but pro-democracy Republicans, will they be able to expel them? I mean, you could see in the last few days, those of you who follow US politics, you could see this fright, this argument, this fight beginning. Representative Liz Cheney, who's a leading Republican in the House of Representatives, who's of course the daughter of the former Vice President, Dick Cheney, has very openly come out and said the election was not stolen. Joe Biden won legitimately. Anybody who says otherwise is threatening, is challenging our democracy. And she has been endorsed by Mitch McConnell, who's the leader of the Senate. But there's also been pushback. When she said that, she was denounced by some of her colleagues. Some members of right-wing media have denounced her and said she's a traitor for saying this. She should be still supporting Trump, even though he lost the election. So the fight inside the party is now genuinely a fight, not about ideology. It's not about who's more right or who's more this or that. It's about, are you still in favor of American democracy as it exists, or are you not? Or are you going to go on living in an alternate reality where you pretend that Trump won, where you pretend that the system was somehow rigged, that there was something wrong with the voting machines, none of which has been proved in any court. And I don't know the outcome of this battle. I mean, as I said, it could be that, it could be that the pro-democracy Republicans win and they expel from the party, or at least from the parliamentary party, from the legislative part of the party, those members eventually. It could be that they start to win, that they challenge those people in primaries and in other elections in the next 2 or 4 years. Or it could be the other way around. I mean, it could be that the radical anti-systemic part of the party starts to chalk up electoral victories. And that's the nature of the argument inside the party. It's, again, not ideological. It's not about who's more conservative in any traditional sense. It's about, do you accept the rules? And to be clear, for Brazilians, we haven't had that kind of argument in the United States since the time of the Civil War, not at this scale. So it's new for us. I mean, I know that it's not new in every country or in every political system. And as I said, the outcome is unclear. And of course, the difficulty is that we're not talking about an extremist party, or we're not talking about a small group of outsiders. We're talking about one of our most important political institutions, the Republican Party. It has a big role. They run the governorships and the legislature of many of our states. They have a big role inside the federal government, inside Congress. They can't be excluded from power. There's no way to say we exclude Republicans. So it's really up to the leadership of the party to try to exclude these extremists, and that will be difficult.
Good, Anne. Simon, join the conversation, please.
Well, it's a big pleasure to be with Anne here in this conversation. She was in Brazil participating in a seminar at the Casa das Garças in 2013, I think, or 14. And this is a book which came out of that seminar. And what we were discussing at the time was the possibility of a democratic path for development, and whether countries like Brazil or India and
South Africa, I guess. South
Africa could be an alternative to the kind of authoritarian development which we were witnessing in China mostly, and Russia in a way. Of course, this 2014 was a time where the economic crisis started in Brazil. And it was the time of the leftist PT party. I'm asked to have some background on Brazil, so I'm introducing some information on that time just to have the conversation going. But at that time, we had still the PT, the Labour Party in government. There was a big economic crisis building up. So the economy went burst. There was an impeachment of the president, and now we had. I won't tell the whole story, but there was an election a couple of years ago in which there was a polarization between the PT party, which was demoralized because of all the economic difficulties and the corruption scandals which affected it, and the extreme right person who was completely an outsider of the Brazilian political system, which is Bolsonaro, and he was able to be elected with a landslide. So we have this kind of extreme right person with a kind of ideology which is complete. It has support in some sectors of the Brazilian society, but it never had before something like that in terms of the Brazilian political system. And the question now is whether there is room in Brazil, as you can discuss in the United States, for a kind of democratic system, because it's very clear that this government, this president, he's trying to corrode, he really tried to break with the institution, the political democratic institutions. He started trying, he several times threatened to have the military to come up with a state coup. He threatened the Supreme Court. So there is a big discussion, and the big question in the country is whether it is possible to create a broad coalition to sustain a democratic system, whether more to the left or more to the right, but away from the extreme of the current government or the extreme of the previous government, which also didn't have much appreciation for the rules of democratic reign. So I think the general question, of course, Brazil is very different than the US or from Europe, but the general question is, what is the space for democracy today, given all the challenges that the democratic system has suffered in different parts of the world. So when I think about the United States, and I have read Anne's book on the twilight of democracy, and I have followed the discussion, what's happening there. But the question is, why is it that in the United States you have this kind of disaffection with the democracy? It grew so much. And so it was just an accident. Just some people decided to be very militant in a kind of aggressive way in order to get more success electorally or some benefits, or was something more deeper in society, which led to this kind of broad disaffection of society. And the question is whether we can expect that this kind of consensus, which is required to have established rules of the game in which each sector of society accepts the other, and in which the political system can work in a stable way, respecting the institutions, etc., can exist. So my question really for Anne is really, why is it that suddenly you have this kind of expansion of this disaffection, of this hostility to the political system in general? And it was just a kind of opportunistic tactics of Trump and some of politicians, and the same in Europe with the development of extreme right? Or was it something deeper, which is happening with the democratic systems at different levels, at different degrees in different parts of the world, which creates a big question mark about the future of democracy in different parts of the world? So this is my main concern, really. I'll stop here.
Anne, your turn.
So thank you, Simon. Yes, I do discuss some of this in my book called Twilight of Democracy. I don't know what the title is in Portuguese. Maybe someone will write it down in the chat. But I know that it's coming out in Brazil quite soon, within weeks, I think, in fact. And I do talk about some of this in the book. In the book, I was mostly interested in the question of elites and why are wealthy, well-educated people drawn to these anti-democratic ideals, which is of course counter to what people usually say. Usually, people talk about the poor or the left behind or the victims of globalization somehow being attracted to autocratic or anti-democratic movements. And my book is not about that. It's about a different question, which is why well-off, successful people are attracted to it. But I think you're asking me something broader, which is the deeper causes, not just among the elites, but among the population. What are the causes of the decline of democracy? And I think it's fair to say that they predate Donald Trump, that Donald Trump is the result rather than the cause. In other words, the fact that someone like him, who used aggressively anti-systemic language, who attacked American institutions, who openly sought the support of Russia, for example, in his election campaign, that someone like that could win an election indicates that there were already deep problems with the American political system before that. I should say, before continuing, that I do think that his 4 years in the presidency also had a dramatic impact on many people and made the situation far worse. So I'm not exempting him here, but I think he's the result. And I think there are a series of things that you can point to. I mean, what interests me is something that you mentioned in your question just now. I mean, there is the extraordinary fact that we have this anti-democratic mood or phenomenon arising, everywhere all at once. I mean, we have it in America, we have it in Brazil, we have it in Poland, we have it in Hungary. We actually have it in France and Germany, although they haven't won power yet, but there are anti-democratic parties there. We have anti-democratic parties in Italy. We certainly have anti-systemic parties and an anti-systemic mood in Britain. That was part of what led to the Brexit vote, although not only. We have them in the Philippines, we have them in Turkey. In other words, what explains this suddenly happening everywhere all at once? I mean, there's, Americans are very, I'm sure like Brazilians, but Americans are always very self-focused. And so we want to talk about our particular problems, the legacy of our Civil War, the legacy of racism, which of course is very important here. But, and we don't notice that the same thing is happening everywhere. And I think because the same thing is happening everywhere, it demands at least some universal explanation. So while there are some elements of American history you can point to, there are also some things that are changing everywhere all at once that are having an impact. I mean, the most obvious and most significant of these changes is the change in the nature of modern information. And by this, I don't only mean social media, I also mean the nature of so-called mainstream media, and particularly television news, which in the United States has become very sensationalized and very polarized. The collapse of the advertising market for mainstream media, which made it much more financially precarious. The change in the nature of media consumption, the fact that we now, read things on our phones and we get, one message is an advertisement for hairspray, and then the next message is a Facebook note from our cousin, and then the third message is about a coup in Burma. How do we know which of these is more important? Which should we pay attention to? So the loss of hierarchies and a sense of importance. And then on top of that, the way in which the most important forms of social media, Facebook is the most prominent, but even Google plays a role here as well as YouTube. The way in which they use algorithms that both enhance and create anger and emotion. They rely on anger and emotion to keep people focused on their platforms, and they also give messages that are designed to reinforce people's pre-existing views. And so they've helped create very deep polarization in all of our societies. I mean, this is very clear in the US, it's very clear in Poland, it's very clear in Germany. You know, I mean, even in Germany, where the far right is only about 10% of the population, you can see that they exist in a completely different media world. I mean, they get different sources of news. They don't read the same things or see the same television or the same videos that the rest of the country sees. So we have the nature of information has changed, making possible this deeper polarization. And, you know, don't forget that polarization by itself creates doubts about democracy. So if you have come to believe that your political opponents are not just wrong, you know, you disagree with them about their economic policy, but evil, then if they take power, you are much more likely to believe that all the institutions they control are also evil. And so the loss of neutral institutions, whether it's the Congress itself, as in the United States, you know, or the bureaucracy, or the courts, as you lose that sense that there are these neutral institutions that are bipartisan or nonpartisan, then people begin to have doubts about democracy itself. And this is a process that you can just see everywhere. And it is deeply and intimately connected to the nature of modern information, social media, the changes in television and newspapers as well. And I think that's a big explanation for what's happened in the United States, where, you know, you actually can't imagine this anti-systemic group coming to existence inside the Republican Party if it weren't for the fact that it has real, that people on Fox News, which is actually a mainstream, you know, television channel with many millions of viewers, everybody gets it on cable television, has been pushing this idea. So the fact that Fox is doing this as a way to retain viewers and get more viewers is obviously a key part of the problem. But you have the equivalent of Fox in many, many other countries. So that's one piece of the story, this law, and with that comes this loss of faith. I mean, I think the second thing that's universal, and this is connected to globalization, although it's not quite in the way that most critics of globalization think, because it's not really about economics. I mean, there is a sense in which people see that their governments or their politicians are less powerful than they used to be. You know, if a decision that somebody takes in China, you know, can close a factory in Pennsylvania, you know, or for that matter, if a decision somebody takes in Washington, you know, or Detroit can close a factory in Brazil, then people begin to lose this sense, you know, our politicians, the people in charge of our countries aren't what they were. They don't seem to have, they aren't in control of our economies. You know, as our economies become more integrated globally, they don't, you know, they aren't able to say things. And the sense that they aren't, you know, they aren't really that powerful anymore, which is, by the way, true. I mean, they aren't as powerful as they used to be, even in the United States, begins to undermine faith in the system. And then when you couple that with another aspect of globalization that has had a big effect on the US and many European countries, which is demographic change. And by demographic change, I mean both immigration as well as emigration. I mean people moving from the countryside to the cities, or in the case of Europe, moving from Eastern Europe to Western Europe, creating kind of left behind cultures. So if you live in rural America, you know, there is this phenomenon that happened, whereas better, more talented people left, you know, many parts of the, you know, rural America, they moved to the cities over the last several decades. You know, my parents are evidence of that, but so are many other people. You know, that means that you left behind communities of the less educated and the less ambitious. And you created this sense of resentment from, you know, rural, from the countryside to the city. In Europe, you have it from Eastern Europe being resentful of Western Europe. Even though, as I said, you know, as I've written in my book, you know, if you look at a country like Poland, Poland is it's just an outstanding economic success. I mean, most countries would dream of having this 30 years of continued success, not one recession, you know, massive growth, you know, tripling and quadrupling the size of the national economy since 1990. Enriching generations of people and you know, building infrastructure you couldn't have dreamed of. A friend of mine was recently visiting me, and we were in a village near our house, in my Polish country house. And she was marveling at the fact that there were sidewalks. I mean, we didn't used to have sidewalks, paved sidewalks in rural Poland. And there's been this huge investment and so on. And yet people feel resentful and they feel left out. And the question is why? And one of the reasons is that they are comparing themselves not to their parents' generation, but to their neighbors in Germany. Why aren't we as rich as the Germans? They are noting that lots of their children want to go and work in Germany or work in England, or work somewhere else, and have left them behind. And they're angry. Paradoxically, the opening of borders inside Europe, which has been such a huge benefit for young and talented and energetic people from Poland or, Bulgaria or Romania, has created this resentment, particularly among older people who don't have those kinds of opportunities, that feeling left behind and feeling this sense of demographic challenge. In the US, in addition to that, you have the demographic challenge from immigration. And some of that, as I saw one of the questions was about racism. Some of that is racism. I mean, some of it is this resentment of brown people coming into the country. And some of it is also this sense of, loss. The community that I remember from my childhood is gone. It's not the way that it used to be. And they're not wrong. Their community has changed demographically and economically and in other ways. And they feel nostalgia for something older. And all of those things, I'll stop now. I was gonna say that the combination of those things, the speed of information change, the speed of demographic change, and the sense that our government isn't really controlling this. And this is why, by the way, open borders are such a symbol of disorganization, even when they aren't very significant. This idea that our government doesn't control the border and we need to take back control, and that was the slogan that worked so well in the Brexit campaign. I think it's a kind of metaphor. We need more control. There's too much happening. There's too much change. We need our government to take back control. And this is inspiring this resentment of liberal democracy, which seems unable to exert these kinds of controls. And it's inspiring these very similar kinds of right-wing movements all over the world.
Good. Let me piggyback on what you said about nostalgia, because this is a subject that do develop in your book. The two different kinds of nostalgia. One is of restorative nostalgia. I'm forgetting the other. But my point here is this far right movements, the message that they try to craft is pretty much the following in various places. It's like the world has become too complex. People are not making sense of it. They think they're losing ground. They feel left out. And I have, surprise, I have something to offer you, right? It's to restore a sort of lost and golden past, right? And you are an expert on systemic lies, right? You have studied totalitarian systems, which are based on big lies. What is the difference between totalitarian systems and the lies that are being crafted by the far right movements in the current days?
So this is the nature of these modern, it's not really an ideology. It's more often based on conspiracy theories. It's a set of arguments about the current system not serving us, or in some cases people are cheating you. The most famous example of how conspiracy theory has been used to back up one of these these kind of alternative ideologies is President Trump's use of birtherism against Obama. So in other words, the president saying over and over again, Obama is an illegitimate president. He was really born in Kenya. He shouldn't be president of the United States at all. This was the argument upon which he came to national prominence as a politician. In other words, he he was already attacking democracy before he ever became president, because he was questioning the nature of the electoral system. We have this fake president, Barack Obama, who shouldn't really be there. And so these are the tactics rather than full-blown Marxism, or complex political theories that we saw in the past. And then I think another very important tactic to understand, which is used now, is the tactic of it's almost a form of impunity, non-stop brazen lying. So we now have the phenomenon, it starts with Putin, actually, with the Russian president, of putting out, the tactic is not to, lie and then cover it up or be embarrassed when someone finds out that you've said something that's not true. The tactic now is to lie repeatedly, constantly, and all the time. And then let everybody else scramble around worrying about what's true and what's not true. Again, Putin, the Russian president, invented this tactic. You can see how it worked, for example, after that plane was shot down over Eastern Ukraine in 2014. What did the Russian press do after that? They didn't deny Russian involvement. As it later turned out, it was a Russian army unit that had shot down the plane, who were fighting together with Ukrainian separatists. They didn't deny it. They just put out a million different explanations. Maybe the plane was, maybe it was an American false flag operation created to embarrass Russia. Maybe the plane was trying to shoot down Putin's plane. Millions of explanations, leaving people with the feeling that we have no idea what's true and we will never know what's true. And Trump did something like that while he was in office, in the White House. I mean, the groups that tried to tally the number of lies he told, from big lies to little lies, from the numbers of people who were at his inauguration to the bills he'd signed or not signed, come up with numbers in the tens of thousands. Many, many times a day, he said things that were untrue. And this constant stream of untruth, which is partly made possible, again, by this proliferation of media, that means that, we hear things before we're able to check them, is also eventually creates this sense of, we don't know what's true. We have no idea what's really going on in Washington. We will never know what's true. And it makes people apathetic and, again, doubtful of the system. And it creates this anti-systemic feeling. So these are both the use of nostalgia, this kind of backward-looking ideology, the use of conspiracy theory to undermine people's confidence in their knowledge and their understanding of the world. And then thirdly, this tactic of constant lying. These are all tactics that have been used by Putin, used by Trump, used by Erdogan, over and over again. These are the tactics of the new authoritarians.
Simon, you have a question to ask. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, just a comment. I think the person who started with this kind of repeated lie was Goebbels in Germany. There was a very, very famous phrase attributed to him, that you repeat a lie 1,000 times it becomes true. And but my question is really looking to the future. I mean, given all this context of the rise of these extreme movements independently of the social conditions, you mentioned Poland and how Poland was doing so well. Chile in Latin America is the country who's doing best. And that's probably the country where the population is more strongly mobilized against any kind of government. And they go to the streets, extremely violent manifestations. And it's very similar. It's a kind of, they don't compare with other Latin American countries or with them, where they were in the past. They compare with some expectations they have, and it's far away. But the question is really, what is the future of democracy then? And more specifically, what is the future of the Democratic Party and the Biden government? So can you say that this victory of the Democratic Party was just an occasional success, which will not last very much, because all the trends, all the tendencies toward this kind of extreme movements is very strong and it's possible to control? Or can we expect that in a way that this extreme right will be contained and we will return to a kind of more normal situation? And you can generalize the question more broadly. Is there a future for democracy in Latin America, in Europe, in the United States, given all this context of factors leading to extreme radicalization and insatisfaction, etc., which you described so well.
Let me just point out, Anne, that questions are pouring, and some of them are related to that issue raised by Simon. Is Biden's victory a kind of watershed, or is just a transient episode that will not leave its mark in history?
So first of all, I don't know.
Nobody knows. Yeah.
I don't have a crystal ball. I can't predict the future. All I can tell you is I do think that Democrats and liberal Democrats were very complacent before 2016 about what could happen and what forces were being aligned against them. And I think they are not complacent now. And this is true in the US, and it's true in many European countries, and I'm sure it's true in Brazil too. And so people have now begun to think very hard about how do we restore democracy, how do we restore a sense of consensus, which is what we're talking about, political consensus, and how do we move forward. And there are some very long-term answers. My view is that very, very, very important, even critical, is the regulation of social media and the regulation of the internet more broadly. I mean, that's a very complex conversation, and we probably not got time for it today. I believe it is possible. There are actually some interesting Brazilian thinkers on this subject, and I've just written a very long article that will be out in a month or two on this subject. I think that thinking creatively about how we can regulate or have some insight into algorithms, thinking about how the internet can be used to promote democratic conversation, how we can create some kind of idea of public service social media where the algorithms are set to encourage civil conversation and not anger and polarization. I think all these things are possible. That's the really important long-term view. In the short-term view, there are tactical things that are being done you can see it in the Democratic Party in the United States, and you can see it in other parties elsewhere. You will notice that Joe Biden, since becoming president, has not denounced Trump. I mean, he hasn't spent very much time talking about Trump. Occasionally he gets asked something about him and he makes a dismissive we might not give him security clearance or something like that. But it's not he doesn't give speeches about Trump. He doesn't say anything about Trump. He has taken no part in the impeachment of Trump. He says that's up to Congress, let them decide. And this, I believe, this is a deliberate strategy. The strategy is to change the subject. So we're having a national culture war. Tempers are very high. People are very angry. And Joe Biden is saying, let's talk about how to fix the economy. Let's give a lot of money to people in a major government program. Let's speed up the vaccination process and get everybody vaccinated as fast as possible. And by changing the subject to practical and pragmatic themes, themes, by the way, that enjoy popular support, majority support, and which might have if we're lucky, will have the effect of reviving the economy. This is actually a strategy. And the strategy is to get people onto the subjects where we can debate, and we can all have a debate about whether it's a good idea to give people $1,400 checks or $2,000 checks, and we can have legitimate differences about that subject, and we can debate it in Congress or in the media without killing each other, right? But once we start talking about these existential issues, what's the definition of America? Did Trump, was the election stolen? Then people become hysterical, and you can't have that conversation. So trying to return the conversation to something tangible is attacking. This, by the way, is was Biden's electoral tactic as well. He didn't run, although some people wanted him to, he didn't run the campaign as a kind of culture war, Democrats against Republicans. He ran talking about unity, issues that unite us, how much everyone loves their family and wants a good job. I mean, literally very, very basic things. And I think that's the political strategy, and we'll see if it works.
Yeah, I mean, you're underlining an interesting aspect, and well, you put emphasis on the sort of systemic factors that are leading to the rise of the far right. But at the same time, you're saying it depends on how strategic the opposition to the far right act, in the way they communicate, in the way they make
Yeah,
alliances. Edmar Baixa, who is the dean of economists in Brazil, were asking a question in that line, whether this is a systemic flaw of the democratic system under the pressures of the contemporary society, or is just a question of doing the right thing politically, of the forces of the center realizing how serious a threat the far right poses and react to it accordingly. And based on the lessons you've learned in Central Europe, for instance, Poland, Hungary, and in the United States, what would you recommend would be the right things to do and the mistakes to avoid if we want to make the center hold?
So I think both are true. I think there are systemic reasons why the far right is doing well. But I think there are both, as I said, long-term systemic changes that can help. And then in the short term, there are tactics that we can adopt that, might make the situation better. I mean, that's the way I would put it. So I think not falling into the trap of fighting the culture war, somehow not having an election be about people's identity, having it be about issues or political issues and this is not always possible, okay, but not letting the far right set the agenda, let the Democrats, the centrists, the center right, the center left, if they can set the agenda, if they can determine what it is that we're talking about, then they have a better chance. I'm not saying they will win, but they have a better chance of winning. So we're not arguing about abortion and women's rights and, or whatever is the issue in your country that is setting people, against one another. Instead, we're arguing about, how do we fix the roads? That's and the more that the centrists, the pro-Democrats can do this, the better. In addition to that, we need social media regulation. In addition to that, we need better civic education. This is very true in the United States. I'm sure it's true in other countries too. So there are other bigger long-term things that we need to do. And by the way, I'd say as one final thing, we also need to take some of the, that sense of lost control, the panic about demographic change. We need to take those seriously as issues. They're not non-issues. There is a racist element to the argument about immigration, but it's not the only element. And finding ways to talk about it that acknowledge that and don't ignore people or brush them aside is also really important, particularly for the left, to do. So, don't just say everybody who's against immigration is a racist, because that's not true. Or there are other reasons why people are afraid of immigration besides racism, and addressing that is also very important.
Do you see the opposition in more broadly? How do you see that the relationship between the European Union on the one hand, Poland and Hungary on the other hand, playing out in the future? There is tension here. Do you think the European Union has been complacent with Poland and Hungary, or what is your take in that regard?
That's a difficult institutional question. I don't know if it's of broad interest to Brazilians. It's an example. What the problem for the European Union is that it wasn't really set up to monitor the health of democracy in its member states, and it doesn't have institutions that do that, and it doesn't have a way to cope with that that's very coherent, because that wasn't in the minds of the people who were creating it. They weren't thinking about that. They were thinking a lot about people who would violate the economic rules of the European Union. They have very elaborate ways of seeing how much, whether you're spending too much or breaking the budget or whatever. I mean, they monitor that, particularly if you're in the Eurozone, but they don't have a way of monitoring democratic health, and there's certainly no sanctions that they can use in an easy way, when asked to do something about it. So I kind of have some sympathy with the European Union. I mean, I do think that we are reaching a breaking point where, particularly, funny enough, in Poland, which is still a democracy, unlike Hungary, which I think is not a democracy, still in Poland, we are reaching a breaking point where the changes to the court system are so dramatic that they're beginning to affect other countries. Other countries in Europe are beginning to not recognize decisions by Polish courts because the courts have been politicized. And that's really going to be a problem because European Union depends on mutual recognition of one another's legal judgments. And that could lead to some kind of dramatic standoff with the Polish government soon. But not because the European Commission will decide about it, but because it will become impossible for Poland to operate normally inside the single market if people aren't accepting the rules of its courts. I don't know. The union is very divided on this. There are some who think we should kick them out. There's some who want to crack down. There's some who say we don't have the legal means to do that, and they're not wrong. So it's not that the EU doesn't recognize the problem. It does. It's that it doesn't really have the tools yet to deal with it, and there is just a big argument going on about what should be done.
Simon, I have one more question here to put you. Now, one of the things that struck me in your book is how close were the relations between Orbán, the Hungarian prime minister, and parts of the Tories in the UK. So you read the book and you have the sensation that the influence of someone like Orbán is more widespread than one would have thought initially. Is that the case, or I'm exaggerating a little bit?
So Orbán has he's tried very hard to get support from sort of so-called, normal conservatives and conservative parties all over Europe. So this is one of his political tactics to stay in charge and to not be kicked out of the EU, as we were talking about before. And he made a big outreach to British conservatives, partly appealing to their ignorance of Hungary. They don't really understand, none of them speak the language and know what's going on. But partly also appealing to their, he uses the language of tradition, culture, Western civilization, traditional marriage, marriage has to be between men and women. He pushes back against things they don't like gender studies programs and, the cultural left. And he, by aligning himself with many of those issues, he made himself seem, a kind of attractive ideal. Look, here's a real political leader. He's fighting back against the cultural left in his country. We should be on his side. And they tend to ignore or downplay his assault on democracy. I mean, what they're supporting him for is, this pushing him back against left-wing culture, and they either don't understand or don't care or aren't bothered by the way in which he's undermined democratic institutions. I mean, I think that's the best way to put it. I mean, it's kind of Orbán's, this is his strategy. I mean, he does it in Germany too, of course. He looks for German conservatives, particularly in one part of the right, the ones from Bavaria who are more aligned with him culturally. And he looks for conservatives elsewhere to be on his side. I mean, and that's his tactic for maintaining, he's constantly trying to portray himself as a mainstream conservative. I'm not a radical. I'm not an extremist. I'm aligned with all these conservative thinkers, respected conservative thinkers. So it's kind of a tactic. By the way, I will have to stop soon because I know that we've been cut off a few times, but
me too. Yeah. So we are approaching the end of this conversation. One final question: how organically linked these different movements and parties of the far right are? is there just a sort of scattered phenomenon, or there's something in the backstage? They're linking them in a sort of an international of the far right.
So I wrote about this a little bit in the book. There is, I mean, it's not a formal linkage. It's not like the old far left used to be, you know, there's a communist international and, you know, we have public meetings periodically. It's you know, it's looser, partly because some of them are embarrassed by the others, partly because there's a, you know, I mean, honestly, I mean, the French far right and the German far right, you know, there's a long history to not getting along. I mean, you know, immediately you get them all in the room together and they'll start arguing over where the border is. You know, it's that kind of, but they have unified around a few issues that they all have in common. And one of them is immigration. And the other is pushing back against what they see as the undermining of traditional ways of life and marriage and, you know, and, you know, sort of mostly male, female, and family relations, and they agree on those things, and there is a way in which online they are, you know, they support one another. There are trolls in various countries that, you know, will exchange information with one another. They use many of the same tactics. They copy one another's tactics, sometimes to the extent of, I mean, literally kind of, you know, word for word. I mean, I have a colleague in Spain who studies online disinformation, and you will find this interesting, found exact copies, you know, kind of fake news websites that were set up for the Brazilian elections were then copied for the Italian elections, same format, same kind of language, same structure. So they've learned from one another. They're using the same PR tactics. They're using the same language, even when they aren't allied in some kind of formal, you know, public alliance as they once would have been.
Final question. Any idea where their money comes from?
I mean, that's an interesting question. There is some Russian money in the mix. I can't say that it is everywhere, but it is in some places. Clearly, there's big Russian influence and involvement, for example, in the German far right, in the AfD has multiple Russian links of many kinds. Certainly, there's a lot of Russian funding for the online operations, the disinformation operations that you see. I have to be very careful how I say this, but there is some money that comes from a part of the Catholic right or the Christian right, sometimes the American Christian right, that is involved in funding some disinformation campaigns. Again, some of this is loose, some of it's got some proof behind it, some of it has less, but there's been a little bit published about that as well. But it's also important to remember that a lot of these things aren't very expensive. You know, it doesn't cost that much to create a troll farm. You know, it's cheap actually. And once you learn the tactics and technology, it's not you don't need, you know, a huge war chest and lots of money to run a disinformation campaign. You can, you know, a few guys can do it, you know, from their garages. So I'm not sure that following the money, I mean, it will tell you a little bit about these movements, but it doesn't tell you everything. I mean, they also just don't need that much funding. They operate quite cheaply.
Thank you. Thank you so much for making the time to be with us today. I apologize for those many who have sent questions through the chat here. I was having difficulties to navigate among so many questions. I tried to convey some of them to Anne. Sorry if I haven't been able to ask them all. Simon, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. And good luck. Stay safe. I hope to see you soon.
Yeah, I hope to be in Brazil very soon.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Take care. Bye-bye, Simon. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.